Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Memories of the Future. This is a collection of stories by Sigizmund Krzhizhanovsky, and these are incredibly effective. The titular story, Memories of the Future, is really a full novella. But across these, there's an incredible range that Krzhizhanovsky displays. He was writing these in the 1920s, early 1930s, sort of the first decade and a half of the Soviet Union. And he did not publish these. He did not publish these during his lifetime. They were not published until 30, 40 years after he had died in 1950. And there's a reason for that. These were very much stories for the drawer, stories like the notebooks or some of the novels of Victor Serge or Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, where the writer could not publish these and remain alive under Stalin's Soviet Union. But Krzhizhanovsky fits very firmly with the very best surreal writers of the 20th century, the very best imaginative, speculative writers, the very best writers in terms of getting at ironies and satire that reveal the deeper truth of a human condition or of life within a totalitarian society specifically. And Krzhizhanovsky carries that off with aplomb. He does it in very short stories. He also does it in stories that are longer and far more formally innovative and experimental, but he also can do it in this long titular Memories of the Future, this longer story examining what the nature of time is, the nature of space is, and through that questioning all these probing ideas, not just around life within the Soviet Union, but life before that in Imperial Russia and Tsarist Russia. And so this is a marvelous, marvelous collection. If you're at all interested in stories by writers like Jorge Luis Borges, Italo Calvino, writers like Kafka, Nikolai Gogol, Donald Barthelme, Julio Cortázar, those are all writers who came to mind as I was reading these. And I want to talk just a little bit about the specific way Krzhizhanovsky gets at these ideas. But I don't want to talk too much about any one particular story in this video. I'd kind of like to do a couple of videos, probably definitely one on Quadratrin, one on the bookmark, and then one on Memories of the Future itself, because I think all three of those really have enough in them to demand a really thoughtful exploration of what's going on. But for the first story, Quadratrin, it's essentially a very simple premise that becomes Kafkaesque or Borgesian, where a character who's living in this small apartment suddenly finds a way to make his little 86 square foot apartment get larger. And that seems nice at first, but there are some catches to it, some details, silver linings that turn out to be lead linings that are just going to poison the whole atmosphere. But within it, he constantly builds this sense of wonder, but also a sense of dread. If this is happening, why is it happening? What dangers are attendant upon it? And also, what happens if the folks in charge of the apartment block find out that his apartment is no longer the same size it's supposed to be? The exacting measurements, how dangerous could that be? And so from a very simple premise, Krzhizhanovsky builds this real fascinating story that probes at what does it mean to live in a society where if you don't necessarily feel comfortable and you take an action that might make you feel a little happier, a little more comfortable, suddenly you could be in a lot of trouble, and the danger that's going to follow on that. The ending itself is marvelous and brutally ironic. I think is sort of the phrase I was thinking of as I read Krzhizhanovsky's stories. But he can work within a very simple, focused story something that could be easily anthologized, and a 14-year-old could read it and probably get quite a bit out of it. Similar to something Julio Cortázar does with like House Taken Over. Or he can take a longer story, as he does in the bookmark, and link a whole series of stories that are sort of more and more bizarre and surreal, that start with a character who's sort of telling this frame story of how he came across this bookmark and he put it in a book, but then he didn't end up really reading it and he forgot about it, but now he's found it again, and he starts to get these other stories. And this happens as well in Someone Else's Theme, where characters are sort of telling a story that creates this string of stories that ring around. and allow all sorts of bizarre occurrences. Stories that seem to not follow each other in any way, but then are being tied back by Krzhizhanovsky in some form. Through the narration, he's able to link these surreal set pieces together. Any one of them on its own doesn't really make sense. It's a marvelous like moment or anecdote or parable. It's maybe a 2 or 3 page little detail that's fascinating. But the way that he's able to link these disparate stories together, I think really reveals a sense of mastery in terms of what a storyteller can do. And it also mirrors the way our conversations follow the stream of consciousness. These stories are not explicitly stream of consciousness, but the way in which one story bounces from one idea to another really does mirror the way that someone will tell something and someone goes, oh, that reminds me of, and share this other idea, and then a third person can jump in, and that the sort of basketball or the soccer ball is passed around, the game to different players of the team, and everybody has their moment. And that's what Krzhizhanovsky can do. And then finally, in Memories of the Future, the long, like 80-page novella that's in here, we have him working out these ideas on a much grander scale. He's able to explore ideas around friendship, ideas around loss, ideas around like more explicit science fiction. He has a whole send-up of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, in which he sort of demolishes it in about 2 paragraphs, but has his narrator, he sort of arrogantly say like, oh, he's got it all wrong. This is actually what I'm trying to do, and here's how I'm actually going to accomplish it. And the sensibility that pervades these pages is one of like palpable danger. Krzhizhanovsky is intentionally not publishing these stories. He knows that his life and his future depend on not publishing these stories. He has the example, later on in life of someone like Isaac Babel, who was murdered in the purges. And so Krzhizhanovsky is not doing that. But he's willing to write out these ideas and examine how the promise of change, the promise of progress, has carried with it this poison that is so dangerous for people's lives, for people's futures, and for the sense of freedom that people expect, and instead find themselves sort of crushed in within it. And so I Memories of the Future as a science fiction piece is one of the best science fiction stories, speculative fiction stories I've read from the 20th century. It really does push at ideas around 3 and 4 dimensional space and 4 dimensional space time, and the way that Krzhizhanovsky is sort of theorizing some of these and working it in a way that creates these philosophical questions and this urgency that I think was very real for him and for those around him. So let me know if you've ever read these. As I said, I would like to do some more focused videos on individual stories because I really enjoyed these. More than half of these I thought were absolute fantastic stories I'll reread, stories I look forward to like reading with my daughters one day and talking about with them, or with some of my students who are interested in fiction. So let me know if you've read these. I have not read his other collections. I know there's Autobiography of a Dead Man, and I do have Unwitting Street, so I'm hopefully going to jump into that at some point. But let me know. As I mentioned, Unwitting Street, these apparently collect, I think some have remarked that these are sort of lesser stories. They don't seem to be quite as dangerous and furious as the stories in Memories of the Future, but I'm still going to read them. I think Krzhizhanovsky is a masterful writer. Certainly I was thinking of Nikolai Gogol, especially stories like The Overcoat, The Nose, different ways in which Gogol is able to poke fun at the civil service structure of Tsarist Russia. I think Krzhizhanovsky is doing that a couple of generations later with the birth pangs of the Soviet Union. But this was this was a writer I definitely was thinking of. As I mentioned, Julio Cortázar, his stories, he similarly is able to draw on the danger of totalitarian Argentina in the middle of the 20th century, and the way that sudden shifts there create a sense of imbalance and danger, and shift perspectives. Another writer who produced some very inventive stories and like truly surrealist stories would be Bruno Schulz, The Street of Crocodiles, Sign of the Hourglass. No, it's Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass. I always just read it, Sign of the Hourglass. But Bruno Schulz, who was murdered during the Holocaust, is someone else who really was able to capture that surrealism, very much a contemporary of Krzhizhanovsky. Donald Barthelme, writing a little bit later, again, one of the writers I just keep returning to, someone who there's several of his stories I can just open up and I know, even though I've read them before, I'm still going to be forced to think and question reality and my perceptions of reality in a new way. And that's something that Krzhizhanovsky does marvelously. Another writer, not quite as intense, but equally I think fascinating, would be John Collier with Fancies and Goodnights. This is a really great collection. Robert Sheckley's stories are more explicit science fiction, but I think get stories like The Seventh Victim, I think get at some of the ways that surrealism and social questions sort of fuse together in really interesting ways. Italo Calvino with Cosmic Comics, or even, I think all of his writing that pushes out on questioning the reality that we're inhabiting. Certainly Jorge Luis Borges, one of my all-time favorite writers. I had mentioned Victor Serge, whether it's Unforgiving Years or his notebooks, which can be really interesting to sort of see how he's looking at what's happening during the purges and during World War II and the start of the Cold War. I mentioned as well The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and I think there are links towards the stories of Philip K. Dick. None of these writers could really read Krzhizhanovsky because he wasn't published until more than a generation after he had died. But there's a truth that he is getting at, and that so many of them are each getting at in their own way. So let me know. Let me know if you're a fan of Krzhizhanovsky, if you've read The Autobiography of a Dead Man, if you've read those stories, if they are as strong as these. I'll be looking for a copy. Because this is a writer I want to spend more time with and continue to appreciate. And as always, I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.